I love stories about the paranormal and things that go bump in the night. Sometimes, the things that go bump are creatures or cryptids that shouldn't exist. Other times, they're a little more down to earth. What you might think is a space alien at your door might only be a stranded motorist. And every once in a while, a story will surprise me. I'll hear about it and think, is that true? And if so, why haven't I heard that before? In today's world, you can never be too careful when it comes to believing what you hear and what you read. And when a seemingly fanciful story turns out to have actually happened, well, for me, it's like sifting through mud and finding a speck of gold. And the story I'm about to tell you is just that. It's one of those tales I at first thought had to be either embellished or made up entirely to entertain. It concerns one of the most famous entertainers of all time. Before movies had sound, he was the one who brought the ticket-buying audiences into theaters. His name was Charlie Chaplin. And long after his star had waned, Mr. Chaplin had a strange encounter with grave robbers. Long before Brad Pitt or Chris Pratt, long before there was even sound in movies, there was Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin got his start in vaudeville. And if you've never heard of vaudeville, think of it as like a variety show on stage, much like Saturday Night Live is for TV today. You had music, comedy, and routines tailored to entertain and to titillate. Chaplin excelled in comedy, especially physical comedy or pantomime, which required no words. When silent movies became a thing, he was perfectly suited for it. And in 1919, he co-founded United Artists, which is still around today a century later. Now, most people associate the name Chaplin with the iconic image of his character, the Tramp, that goofy, lovable misfit with the bowler hat, cane, and toothbrush mustache. His star faded over the years, as all stars do, and in 1977, on Christmas Day, Chaplin passed away at his home in Switzerland. He was 88 years old. His wife Una was at his side, and they'd been together since 1943 and had 8 children. The Tramp had lived a good life. It was time to rest. Chaplin had no way of knowing this, but he was about to play another role, a silent role, in an improvised dramatic comedy being developed specifically for him. Chaplin was buried at the Coste cemetery, not too far from his home. When news of his death and burial reached the outside world, it also reached the ears of Roman Vardas, who was then 24. Vardas was excited, not because Chaplin had died, but how his death might benefit him. He had a plan, and to execute this plan he needed help. So we brought another man in. That man was Gancho Ganev. Ganev was 14 years Vardas' senior, and when he heard the younger man's plan, he was skeptical, but figured between the two of them, they could pull it off. It's not like they would be hurting anyone. It was only a little innocent kidnapping. People were kidnapped all the time, and kidnaps often entailed a ransom. Otherwise, what was the point, right? So, who were they going to kidnap? Chaplin's widow, Una? She must be worth millions. Or what about one of Chaplin's 8 children, perhaps one of the younger ones? There could be a hefty payday there. But the logistics of kidnapping a child, or even an adult widow, were complicated. You had to do it without them calling attention to the fact that they were being abducted, hide them somewhere secluded, and keep them fed. And on top of all of that, how do you keep them from identifying you afterwards? Not to worry. Vardas' plan accounted for all of that. They weren't going to kidnap one of the children. They were going to steal Chaplin's body. Problems solved. You see, Vardas had read a story in the paper around the time of Chaplin's death. It had to do with a similar caper that had happened in Italy. The subject of that crime had been a wealthy Italian man who had died and whose body had been held for ransom. Chaplin's family must be rolling in money. He was, after all, world famous, and had been for over 70 years. Both Vardas and Genev were unemployed automobile mechanics, and they could really use the money. But first, they needed to execute their scheme. So, shortly before midnight on March 1st, a few short weeks after Chaplin's burial, the two men snuck into the cemetery under cover of night with a unique plan. They were not going to actually steal the body. No, they were going to exhume the coffin, dig the hole deeper, and rebury the coffin in the same hole to make it look like it had been stolen. Was that a crime? They weren't walking away with anything. Sure, their ransom demand would be frowned upon, but again, they weren't hurting anyone. There was a problem, though. They hadn't accounted for the fact that it was a rainy night, and the digging was made harder by the fact that the wet dirt was too heavy. After digging the coffin up, they didn't have it in them to go any further. They'd been at it for hours. So, they reluctantly decided that the only option left, other than scrapping the entire idea and leaving the coffin where it sat, was to steal it. The coffin was oak, and it was heavy, roughly 300 pounds. So they now had to figure out where to put it. And then it hit them. Why not just rebury it? Not there in the cemetery. A bunch of upturned earth near the original burial spot was sure to be noticed. They'd take it someplace else. A field, maybe. One of the men knew of just the right field, too. There was one in the village of Noville about 10 miles away, and it was a cornfield. It would be perfect. So patting themselves on their backs for their resourcefulness, they transported Chaplin's coffin to Noville, dragged it into the field, and reburied it. Now, for the second, more crucial part of their plan, they would wait for a bit, let people freak out over the missing remains, and then make their ransom demand. While the discovery of Chaplin's empty grave didn't exactly command headlines around the world, it was a shock, especially to the family when they received the call from the police that the coffin was missing. After all, things like this never happened in Switzerland. I mean, who would do such a thing, and why? When there is no immediate answer for something, people tend to make up their own. Rumors began to fly as to why someone would do such a thing. Was it a creepy collector of oddities with a sick and twisted mind? It was also somewhat known that Chaplin had at one time expressed a desire to be buried in his native England. It's where he'd been born after all. Maybe someone had decided to help him out with that. Someone in the family. Then again, maybe it was a bit more sinister. One of Chaplin's movies, The Great Dictator, had been Chaplin's way of attacking Hitler in 1940. It had been Chaplin's first film with sound, and it had raised the anger of neo-Nazis. Perhaps the fact that Chaplin was part Jewish had something to do with it. If so, there was no telling what they might be doing with Chaplin's remains. And then, Chaplin's family received a phone call. Using the name Mr. Rochat, Vardas disguised his voice and made their demand. They wanted $600,000. Not even $1 million, or half that much. They wanted $600,000. Maybe they thought they had a better chance and wouldn't appear too greedy. When presented with the offer, Una, Chaplin's widow, refused. The two men panicked. What now? Was it time to scrap their plan? Well, not to be deterred, Vardas threatened to hurt one of the children, maybe the youngest one. Still, no deal. Una wanted her late husband's body back, but she wasn't going to pay for it. So the two men hunkered down and thought it over. Maybe they had asked for too much. So, how about they return Chaplin's remains at a discounted price? Would $250,000 work? Una remained strong. They wouldn't get a dime. Unbeknownst to Vardas and Genev, the police were busy. They suspected that the mysterious Mr. Rochat was calling from a nearby phone booth. So what did the police do? They put every available man on it and staked out every booth in the area, roughly 200 of them. And then they waited. It was almost too easy. As soon as the call went through, they had their man, or men in this case. Vardas was caught at the phone booth, and the two men had nothing left to do but confess. There was a hiccup, however. They were able to tell the police where the cornfield was, but they couldn't say exactly where in the cornfield they'd buried Chaplin's coffin. After all, it was a cornfield. It was huge, and it had been weeks since they'd last been to the field. And they had buried it deep, too. They hadn't just dug a shallow hole to place the coffin in. Their hole had been respectable, at least 7 feet deep. So, armed with a mine detector, the police searched the field until they'd located the missing remains. The jig was up. All that was left was to figure out what to do about Vardas and Genev. Being the mastermind behind it all, Vardas, aka Mr. Rochat, was given the steeper sentence after being convicted of grave robbery and extortion. He received 4.5 years. Genev, for his involvement, was slapped with an 18-month suspended sentence. Now, both men actually felt bad about what they'd done. Each one wrote to Una Chaplin expressing their sorrow, as did the men's wives. Una's reply? All is forgiven. She was fond of saying that, had Charlie been aware of all that went down, he would have found the entire ordeal ridiculous. I can imagine he'd have had a silent chuckle over it, tipped his hat, and shuffled off into the distance. Now, as far as Charlie's grave is concerned, he now has 2 of them. To prevent something like this ever happening again, the family had his casket reinterred with a concrete coating over it. His second grave is in the cornfield, the very one where he had rested for a few short weeks. The farmer who owned the field put a simple wooden cross there decorated with cane. Una actually visited that second grave several times herself, and she is said to have found it even better than the official grave. Charlie, I am sure, would have appreciated it. And, of course, the absurdity of the entire ordeal. Truth can be much stranger than fiction. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. It really does help others to find the show. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. You can find more information and references that went into this episode by going to strangeencounters.org. I would really like to hear your suggestions also for future episodes. And if you've had a strange encounter with something unusual or paranormal, I would love to hear it. Visit the contact page for information on submitting your story. And until next time, please take care of yourself. It's a strange world out there. Good night.
Synopsis, like your city, save, making show, I'm the solution, it's so.